So I'm going to ask, we're going to start with some questions, and then I think the plan is that then we will then open it up for a larger discussion with you all. So I'm just going to start with a brief introduction of each of you, and then I'm going to go into my questions. So we've got here Zareen Jaffrey, who's Executive Director of the Salam Reads imprint at Simon & Schuster. Then we have Monita Bell, who's a Senior Editor at Teaching Tolerance. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas here, University of Pennsylvania professor who specializes in areas of literacy, teaching African American literature, race, class in the classroom discourse. You can clap. We have Deborah Delisle, who's Executive Director of ASCD, which I didn't write out what that acronym means. Do you want to say?
Sure, Association for Supervision Curriculum Development, and we don't do that anymore.
Oh, okay.
We're 75 years, though, you can't change the acronym.
Okay. Cornelius Minor, who you all just heard from, who works at the Teachers College, and Jean Yang, who's a graphic novelist and creative writing professor. Is that right? All right. So let me first just give kudos for how beautifully diverse this panel is, because that is it's a fairly rare thing. I sit on lots of panels, and unless it's a panel just about diversity, it's usually not that diverse. So the first thing I would like to ask is, literacy means different things to different people, and there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about literacy. So each of us kind of defines it in our own way, and depending on what type of work we do, we define it based on our work. So if you could each kind of give me a quick definition of how you view literacy and how your work is fostering education for democracy and not oppression.
Can you guys hear me okay? So I'm a publisher at a mainstream house, Simon & Schuster, so when I think of literacy, and I publish everything from picture books onto young adults, edgy young adults, as they say. When I think of literacy, I really think about how creative imagination starts from a very young age. And the picture book reading crowd often don't know how to read yet. So it is one of the avenues from which they're developing their sense of the world around them. I think there's a term called theory of mind, how their thoughts and feelings are impacted and become their motivations, and how they see other people, and can kind of consider how those people's thoughts and actions are different from theirs, thoughts and feelings, and determine their actions. And for me, I work with Salam Reads, because one of the imprints I work for, and that focuses on books that feature Muslim characters in a positive light. Not simply positive, but nuanced light. And I recognize the fact that we are pushing back against decades, centuries, in some cases, of misrepresentation and demonization. And literacy, starting from that young age, that connection to narratives and seeing yourself in a narrative in some way, can lead to self-determination and shape how they see themselves within society, which later on develops their ability to find themselves as full citizens, to fight for their full citizenship, to see themselves as people who can have self-determination.
Yeah, I think for me, can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. To piggyback on what Zareen was saying, I very much see literacy as the ability to analyze, interpret, and grasp the world around you. And so that most certainly comes through reading, but not just reading words on a page. I mean, it's reading context, it's reading what you see and hear. And in my work at Teaching Tolerance, this is what we've been saying is our mandate, to educate or help educators educate for a diverse democracy. Our 4 guiding principles right now are the domains of our social justice standards: identity, diversity, justice, and action. You can't just talk about identity and knowing who I am. And for some folks, and I think this is what we're getting at, some of these children don't have a positive sense of their identities because they can see it contrasted against these other identities that are elevated. as opposed to theirs. But knowing all of your identities and appreciating and loving them. And then diversity, doing the same for others that aren't like yours. Perspectives that are different from yours. Backgrounds that are different from yours. But you can't stop at just recognizing your own and others' identities if you don't recognize when people are being treated unfairly because of those identities. Then there's a missing piece of the puzzle there when it comes to literacy. So that's where justice comes in. And then action, once you're able to recognize that unfairness, what are you going to do about it? And so that is really the root of the work that we're doing at Teaching Tolerance and trying to give educators the tools to do that. Not just in their classrooms, because we know that a lot of folks doing good work, they're that one teacher in their room trying to make it work in their classroom, but in the whole school building, in the whole district, and we hope across the country and across the world. So that's the perspective I'm coming from.
I'm still sitting and thinking about Nikole's excellent keynote presentation. I am a native Detroiter. I lived there for 35 years. I'm a product of the Detroit public school system and never left the state of Michigan until I took my job at Penn when I was 35. And so I saw her presentation as singing our whole lives with her words. Often, those of us from the most marginalized United States communities, Detroit, West Virginia, the Deep South, reservations, we are voiceless. We have voice, but we are rendered voiceless by a literacy landscape that sees us as invisible, sees us as non-American or not American enough, that renders us monstrous. So I sit at the intersection of two worlds, one where I'm the only educated person in my family, traditionally educated, because my family is wiser and smarter than a lot of people that I meet in the academy. And also as a literacy researcher trained in the new literacy studies tradition. We just lost one of the fathers of that tradition, Dr. Brian Street, who passed away last month after a long illness. So I believe that literacy is a social practice. But I think I want to open my remarks with two questions. First of all, literacy for what and literacy for whom? So I was part of the talented 10 of Detroit children who were plucked out and selected, who were selected for special schools, so magnet schools. And it was very much a talented 10 philosophy that left most Detroit children behind. This is not new. This has happened for decades upon decades upon decades. Our ancestors, our grandparents and great-grandparents left the segregated South for better employment and educational opportunities. And another journalist, I love journalists because they can communicate all these things we talk about in the academy to the masses. Isabel Wilkerson wrote an editorial about, and I'll close with this, Trayvon Martin, I'm sorry, Tamir Rice, yeah. That left me in tears. She talked about how Tamir Rice's grandparents or great-grandmother migrated north to Cleveland for a better life. And she closed that New York Times editorial with, what would his great-grandmother have, how would she have reacted? I'm sorry, I get so emotional about this topic. How would she reacted when, at what happened to her lineage and her life? America, we're in crisis. And I can bring theory, educational theory, literary theory, literacy theory to you, but this really moved me, so I'm sitting with it. The other question, and I'm not going to elaborate on it, so literacy for what? But literacy for whom? And I think that really ties right into the presentation. I mean, I am suspicious. I mean, I did everything that I was supposed to, but my city was still left in shambles. There are no jobs for people like me in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. So I'm going to leave with that.
Can you give the name of that journalist that you just said that?
Isabel Wilkerson. She wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it's all about the Great Migration.
Say the last name again, I'm sorry.
Wilkerson.
Thanks so much. Always on sitting on panels as you get to the middle, we probably all could say ditto, ditto, ditto. So as was mentioned, I am the CEO of ASCD, so we are 75 years young. And we are the largest, outside of teachers' unions, we're the largest educational membership organization actually in the world. We have 120,000 members across 159 countries. And we primarily are engaged in professional learning opportunities through products and on-site services, et cetera. And so how I come to that role and I think about literacy is actually built on, I've been an educator my entire career. Most recently, prior to ASCD, I served President Obama as the Assistant Secretary of Education for Elementary and Secondary Ed. So all of the pre-K through grade 12 schools were under my purview, and I went into so many of those schools that look exactly, I have pictures of those schools. And it was amazing to me to see those schools, and I always walked into schools with one question on my mind is, would you send your own child to this school? Because what is appalling to me is that in the United States, when the answer to that question is no, we allow schools to be okay for other people's kids.
That's right.
So when I think about literacy, I see it as everything that was mentioned previously and as a deep relational aspect for me. It's how you construct meaning in your life and how you interact with others, from communication essentials like reading and writing and listening, reading your environment. I can't remember who mentioned that is so critical. Walking into a room, seeing what others are wearing, how they're talking, how they're interacting. Those are all roles you play in whatever career you choose. And yet down to a granular level, I am still shocked, going back to are these schools to which you would send your own kids, that with almost the majority of high schools and actually K-12 now being filled with children of color, so few AP courses are filled with kids of color. 82% of schools are now offering post-secondary education options. If you go into those schools where a majority of children or students are of color, they are still not participating in those activities. And if you go in even more appalling to some of those schools, white parents will tell you, well, we have that, so we will stay in your school. It's just heart-rendering to me that we allow schools to not offer hope to kids every single day, because to me, literacy offers hope. A hope for a brighter future for everyone, every kid in America, especially those of color.
I am Liberian, and I start everything with that I was not born in this country. I was born in the Republic of Liberia, and my twice great-grandfather was an enslaved man who could read. And literacy made him unfit for slavery. So he emancipated himself and left. And he and several others founded what we now know as the Republic of Liberia. And I am back on this side of the planet because of the civil war there in Liberia. And so when I think about literacy for me, it's the ability to be self-determining and the ability to choose your own path. I work for a wonderful organization at Teachers College. I was a 7th grade teacher, have been in education since 2000. I've never taught a white student. And now that I work at Teachers College, I spend all of my time supporting literacy among students. And when we seek to cultivate freedom among students, one of the things that I've learned is that you cannot have free students if you don't have free teachers. And so I spend all of my time supporting teachers in doing really rich and liberating literacy work.
You gotta trademark that.
You said literacy is being
Determining.
I'd say I'm probably the least qualified person to be on this panel. I've never made an academic study of literacy. I majored in computer science. So, but I still feel thrilled to get a chance to listen to you all. It is a form of literacy.
Yeah.
It is. You know, from the perspective of a parent, I'm the father of 4 kids. What I tell my kids is, if you can learn how to read, you can learn how to learn anything. You know, it is that foundational skill that so many of you have talked about. It's almost like a superpower. I'm also a comic book guy. It's almost like a superpower. It's a superpower that will lead to other superpowers. Right now, I'm serving as the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature for the Library of Congress. Just a fancy way of saying it's kind of my job to get both more kids reading and kids reading more. So I really believe in the emotional connection to books. So I really think that part of our work as parents and part of our work as educators is to find that love, to find that line of love between the kids in our lives and the books that surround them.
Great, thank you. So when I think about literacy, I think about the fundamental, can you read words? And then you think about the ability to expand the way that you think and see your world. So it allows you to think, to question, and probably most importantly in a democracy, to push back, right? You have vast swaths of our country who are ill-equipped to push back against powerful people who are constraining their circumstances and their choices. And when you look, for instance, at the civil rights movement, most of the people who led that movement were either people who joined the military and had gone abroad and seen a different way and were treated a different way and understood the fundamental hypocrisy of being sent to fight for freedom elsewhere, so only to come home to be lynched for wearing your uniform. And they were those who were educated in college. And it was college students who largely led the movement in the South. I've been doing some reporting, and one of the interesting things about the South in trying to comply with Plessy v. Ferguson, they start to send black people who have graduated from college and want to get a graduate degree out of state because there are no graduate programs for black people in the South. And they will pay them. So if you were smart enough, you could go to Harvard and only have to pay the same tuition that it would cost you to go to Alabama for law school, which is an amazing deal for you. But it shows you how frightened they were of an educated populace, because the hope was you'll go to Harvard or you'll go to Columbia and you're never going to come back to Alabama to challenge the system, because once you've had a taste of freedom, why would you come back? And the people who bring down that system are the people who went away and came back and challenged that. That's not really a question. I'm going to get to a question. So we have, this question is for Cornelius and Deborah. We clearly have a vastly unequal education system that produces vastly different outcomes for students, particularly along race and class lines. How can we use literacy, both small literacy, fundamental reading, but also big literacy, the ability to read something and to question and to analyze and to think about a circumstance beyond that you're living in? How can we use literacy to disrupt cycles of inequality, and how can literacy best be used for social change?
So one of the things I think, actually a couple of things pop into mind, one of which is, this was a personal experience when I was working for the president. There was a big move, and I don't know if many people outside the Washington bubble recognize this, but President Obama was putting a stake in the ground in early childhood learning, and he actually made a proposal for all 4-year-olds in the United States, eventually to get to 3-year-olds, to go to high-quality preschool programs. And the reason for that was all based on a literacy issue. 30 million word gap when kids enter kindergarten. So we think of kindergartners as entering school at the same starting point, and they're not. And that 30 million word gap actually increases. I know you all know that. So when I think about this, I think how we cannot wait until middle school or high school to figure this out, but we have to figure it out from day one. Kids' exposures to books, what does that mean? How do we get books in the hands of all kids, kids in poverty, et cetera, kids of color, kids who don't necessarily have the environment that is actually predisposed to high quality educational opportunities. So kids start early on. We got to get that out in the long piece. And I'm going to even take it back further. I really question how, and I know some of you alluded to this, how open, how talented, how skilled adults in the lives of kids are to actually have critical conversations with one another about their own practices. So I've tried to work really hard in that role, as well as being the Commissioner of Education in Ohio with teacher training programs, present company excluded. It is really hard to get people to change in teacher school, as I call it. So I run the gamut of recognizing the social constructs on the very early stages of kids' lives, all the way through to how we're training the adults who are going to be interacting with kids. And are they ready to have critical conversations among themselves? In addition to, are they willing to step into classrooms and question what books are used, what novels are promoted, what kinds of conversation and discourse can they actually have in a classroom, and then even among themselves to question their own practices. So I could go on and on.
Before
with
you
this.
answer, Cornelius, the journalist in me just can't resist asking this follow-up question. That study that you listed, I have always been highly skeptical of that study that says that there is a 30 million word gap between, I mean, I'm middle class and educated, and I promise you I'm not saying that many different types of words in my household. How?
Well, it's utterances of words, so it's not actually words. It's utterances in kids, what they hear on a regular basis.
But
So I wanted to
can you
clarify that.
explain, because I read the study, and again, it did not feel true to me, and it felt really as another, I feel like everyone embraced it because we pathologized the poor.
Sure.
But it just didn't, not being a social scientist and not being able to really decipher the method, it never felt real to me. And I wonder if any of the, scholars on here may have some thoughts on that as well.
Well, in the interest of time, I'll just say that that study is extremely contested.
I get that. Yeah.
Oh, you know what, sorry, your
The study
microphone's
is-
not
yeah,
working.
The study is contested.
They want
So-
you to use this one because they
Yeah,
said,
so one of
I
the
don't want to
ways
show
that
my business.
one of the ways that I've thought more strategically about it is, even in its flaws, we cannot, I don't think it's even open for debate that kids are coming to school at different starting points. So if it's 30 million, if it's 1 million, if it's 500,000, if it's 2,000, there's a differential there in kids' prior experiences that can't be caught up in school unless there's a very strategic way that people go about it. And there are pockets across the country where people have closed gaps. And I'll just say one other thing about that is I feel like I'm the only one on a horse riding across the country on this. I'm really sick and tired of talking about achievement gaps because I'd rather focus on opportunity gaps.
Right.
Because achievement gaps to me, and I've heard this long, I taught it, they didn't learn it. We know who they is. I taught it, they didn't learn it. We gave them extra time, they didn't take advantage of it. We had extra classes, they didn't do it. It becomes a kid's problem and not the adult's problem. And yet opportunities exist. The AP coursework is an example of that. Paid internship, mentorships, who gets into STEM classes, who's going into engineering. Just a whole host, I can go on and on about that. So I'm not suggesting that I'm buying into all 30 million words or is it 19 or whatever. What my point is that whether that's accepted or not, there is a differential gap that kids experience when they come into schools, and we just haven't figured out how do you jumpstart every kid to be successful in schools, particularly those who are already marginalized.
And Deborah, your microphone's actually working. It's Ebony's.
sorry, it was yours.
So no, you need the mic. No,
right.
no,
I know
don't pass the mic.
Pass
Pass it back.
it back.
Give it to Ebony.
Is yours on?
I love it.
Your microphone is not working. Everyone else's microphone is
I
fine.
wasn't
Okay.
really hugging you. I was just trying to see if your microphone was on. No, you're fine.
Wow.
Okay, Cornelius, do you want to?
So the question, how can literacy be weaponized to really affect change? And there are several things that I think. One thing, first of all, like when I think about integration and how it happened historically, Black people suffered tremendously. You know, like I'm a Black teacher. Many Black teachers lost their jobs, you know, and so
Yeah.
I have an old African dad and he says old African things. And one of the things he says, you know, like white people catch a cold, Black folks catch pneumonia, you know, and so that idea that integration as it happened left people like me jobless and without work. I'm always thinking about how then I, in this generation, use literacy to impact some change. And I think we've been looking at the wrong folks. You know, I don't think, you know, people of color, did not invent racism, so we are not the ones to fix it. You know, that racism is a white people problem. Like, you know, and I've been really, really specific about that like communities of white folks have to get together to figure out how we gonna do this. So if I'm the only one working to fix a thing that is happening to me in a moral society, that's flawed. You know, and
Assuming the society is moral.
So I think for me, one of the things that I'm really into is I spent my entire career helping students of color to be literate, and now I'm working on helping white parents to be literate. You know, I'm from Park Slope, Brooklyn, you know, and the amount of opportunity hoarding and just like willed segregation, you know, and I have a daughter like you who just entered school, and just the combativeness with which parents want their kid in and your kid out. And it's 2017 on 6th Street in Brooklyn, you know, so like, and so I think for me, I've really been trying to force white people into a position of not just being allies, but accomplices. That's big for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this question is for Zareen and Jean. So it seems to me one of the most critical components of literacy are students being exposed to books and reading that reflect their lives. And I often think when we accuse children of not reading or families of not reading, what we know is that Hollywood understands that if you cast a film with all people of color, suddenly white people don't want to see the film. That, and there are studies that show this, that decisions about who to put on the cover of a magazine are racialized. That if you want white people to buy a magazine, you need to have a white person on the cover. But when it comes to children literature, we think that black and brown children should be engaged with reading when none of the books that they're reading look like their communities. They don't tell their stories. The first time I took a Black Studies class, we had a one-semester class in my high school, and it changed my world. And I was angry, because I was like, all of these years when you felt like people like you had never done anything positive, had never accomplished anything, and there was all this history and all these stories someone could have taught me that no one bothered to teach me, I think was a transformative moment for me. And we know that texts are a huge problem with why children are not engaged with reading. So I wonder if you both could talk about your work and how critical it is to be providing that teachers are reflecting in the curriculum and in the text that they're introducing children to stories that reflect their lives. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
I can tell you when I was a kid. When I was a kid, it was just hard to find stories with characters who looked like me or lived like me in the books that I was reading and the shows that I was watching and the movies that I was watching. And I think you just kind of gravitate, you just kind of grab what you can. I am a lifelong superhero fan. I think one of the reasons why I love superheroes so much is because almost every superhero has that dual identity, right? They are negotiating between two different ways of being. And as an Asian American, that was my reality. I had two different names. I had a Chinese name that I used at home, an American name that I used at school. I spoke two different languages, lived under two different cultural expectations. So when I watched Clark Kent change into Superman in my comic, there was something about that felt familiar. I tried to find what I could. And out of all of the assigned reading that I did throughout my entire school, like, you know, from K to 12, the only book that I ever finished before the due date was Black Boy, because that was the only book that did not feature a white character.
Right.
There was something about that book, even though his life was completely different from mine. I was an Asian American kid living in the suburbs, but there was something about that book that spoke to me because I felt the outsiderliness
That's right.
that Richard Wright lived through.
Yeah, and there are so many layers to this question, really. And you know, from my personal experience, I grew up first generation. My parents immigrated from Pakistan a couple years before I was born. I never saw myself in books, but at the time, it was sort of a melting pot world where I had internalized this idea that I needed to blend in. And my parents had always made it very clear that we were here to get a great education. That's why they moved to the other side of the world for their kids to have a great education and to succeed. And I interpreted success, as I think many kids did, as being able to navigate in white societies. I grew up in Connecticut, so as I got older, I really recognized the fact that my ability that I had honed to navigate in white society and in white spaces is why I was succeeding, and it started to feel bad. You know, it started to feel like I was denying my own spirit, my own personality, my own culture. And at the time, you know, I was going higher in the publishing world, and I got to a place where I could start acquiring my own books. And with colleagues in publishing because, it's a largely liberal community, very homogenous. It's mostly women from the Seven Sisters schools. Everybody means well. It is hard for them to hear that their industry is considered racist. But the truth is, and what I tell them, is that publishing is not immune to the racism that exists in society. And these instincts that we feel that we have are actually shaped by the culture we grew up in. And when we talk about diversity especially, there's a very obvious implication that we're diverting from something. And that something is a very homogenous narrative that has existed for centuries. And one of the criticisms I get sometimes is, well, if you look at the statistics, which I think are actually not true, wherever these people find these statistics, the percentage of books about Black Americans is actually at about 10%, which is in keeping with the American population at this time. Books that feature Muslims are at 1%, which is in keeping with the population at that time. I'm like, okay, well, what is the percentage in libraries and in bookstores? We're coming from a world where there really have preferred certain narratives, and that has an impact on the kids who are growing up in this country and not seeing themselves as important enough to be celebrated in art. And I say celebration, it doesn't have to be stories that are only positive. They can be stories that deal with some tragedies too, because that's a celebration of our humanity and the way that we connect to each other. I will say one of the things that I've noticed about and published lately is seeing certain communities that have traditionally been demonized through a very specific lens of like this subtle victimization, where it'll be a story from Afghanistan about this couple who, their families won't let them be together for tribal reasons. And we'll bring that, into the U.S. market because it reinforces this idea that they're different. Like American values are the values of true love, and that just again reinforces something that I think leads to otherization. And so with Salam Reads, what I really try to do, and what has been very difficult actually, is only publish books that center the humanity of the character. And I want to make it clear that the books that I publish are not about the Islamic religion, they're not about theology or history, because quite honestly, those things are very heavily contested. We make 1.8 billion people in the world, and in the US we come from 70 different countries. 30% of the Muslim population is Black Muslim, which gets totally erased. A large percentage of Muslims in the US come from poverty levels, and that is never depicted either. It's usually underneath the Desi, which is the South Asian community, or the Arabs. So in my trying to publish more books that talk about what it's like to be Muslim in the world, it has been a challenge, and privilege comes up all the time. People who are from upper middle class communities are the ones who have the access and the resources and the time to commit to the craft of writing. So this is a long-term effort. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes. Okay, so this next, how many of you guys are educators in here? Okay, good. This one's for y'all. So I'm going to ask this one specifically of Monita and Ebony, but anyone who wants to jump in can jump in on this. So we know that we have a country that is changing, but a teaching profession that is not. That the teaching profession remains overwhelmingly white, even as our classrooms, particularly public schools, are getting more and more Black and Latino and Asian, and more heavily low income. And there's also been a series of studies that show that white teachers have lower expectations of Black children, that they discipline them more harshly, that they're less likely to believe that Black children can achieve, and even a study that just came out maybe a week and a half ago that young Black girls are seen as older and in less need of nurturing. So my question is, what is the work that needs to be done to ensure that those who are, I'm not going to remember the Malcolm X quote, and I'm not calling anybody an enemy, but he was like, only a fool that's an enemy educates his children. And what he was saying was that people who do not believe in your children should not be the ones who are educating your children. Though we would assume that most people who go into education do believe in the power of education and that they do want to educate all children, but they are part of a society that conditions you in racial ways. So for you two, and again, anybody who wants to jump in, what are the ways that we can disrupt that we can ensure that those who are educating children, even if they don't come from those backgrounds, are not educating children in a biased way? What are the things that educators in this room need to do to ensure that I don't like words like implicit bias, so I think people start to roll their eyes at those terms, but who can ensure that whatever biases they have, whether they know them or not, are not affecting their teaching, and how do they overcome them?
Yeah, I know people have problems with the term implicit and explicit bias, but as you just mentioned, Nikole, we all are kind of growing up in a society and a world that socializes us in particular ways, and that is very white-centered. We know that about 80% of the teaching profession is made up of white female teachers in particular, and so we have to be real about that. I was just talking to someone yesterday, and I forget where her district is, but in her school, all of a sudden, one year they had 6 ELL students for the first time ever. Nobody trained in the school to deal with English language learners. No one with any experience, yet those kids needed to be educated. And so you have to think, if you come from a situation in which the faculty is all white, the student body is all white, but suddenly you have 6 kids from a different country who have a whole host of different experiences and worldviews and perspectives, that bias is going to enter the equation, because there are things you just don't know, that you're ignorant about. And we're all ignorant about things. So I think you have to start with some self-reflection, and there are tools for that. You can take implicit bias tests online. You can seek out professional development that actually engages specifically with bias, because in a way, it's like you don't know what you don't know in some ways. You don't know what you don't know about yourself in some ways. And I just want to make it very clear that we all have biases, Black, white, Latino, whatever the case may be. So don't think that you're one of these people like, well, I don't have biases. Yes, you do. And so, I mean, you do. And I think it's just incumbent on all of us, and absolutely educators who are working in the classroom with these young, vulnerable kids, to do the work internally. Ask yourself these questions. There are these tests and professional development. If you go to Teaching Tolerance, we have some tools as well to sit with yourself, ask yourself some hard questions. And then once you can actually identify, well, I do have a bias toward, I recognize boys when they speak more than I recognize girls, because it's not just racial biases either. Once you recognize those things in yourself, then you can start to do the work to counter it. And that doesn't mean you're going to obliterate them from your mind, because there's a brain wiring thing in here too that you have to contend with, but you can make conscious choices not to act on them. And so I think starting with the self is key there.
That seems too easy. Right, I feel like most educators that I talk to do not believe that. I mean, they believe in kind of this vague idea that we're all biased, but that personally I'm not acting in biased ways. And I think that's all of us, right? I think that is human nature to think, well, I'm not actually like that, and I'm not judging the Black student more harshly. He just acts up more. He's just not acting like the other kids. So and I don't know that taking implicit bias tests, even if it shows that you have that bias, helps you figure out how do you overcome that in the classroom. So I'm wondering if someone can give like something more specific that people can do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you guys can tag team on that.
Go ahead, jump in.
I work in an amazing school in Seattle, Denny International Middle School, and we wanted to take this on, where a group of teachers, incredible teachers, and we wanted to like locate it at literacy. And so what we asked ourselves were like, who are the kids in this school building that don't read? And so we made a list, and then we decided that we were going to invest 3 hours a week in those kids. So like, I'm taking you to lunch, I'm going to watch basketball with you, I'm going to sit with you in the library and choose a book. And so just that simple act to say, you know what, like, I'm recognizing that this system that I have built allows certain kids to not perform. So how do I disrupt that system? I invest extra in those kids. And so it wasn't a program, but we just decided, how are we going to rally around the kids that we're afraid to lose, and not in a punitive way, but in a way that affirms who they are, that builds relationships. And so I kind of think we got to do the math on it. You know, that a lot of times we want equity or equality, but we're not willing to kind of, again, equally distribute the resources. And I think one of the things that certain kids need more.
Yeah, it's not even
That, you know, that idea
equally,
that,
right.
that fair is not mean equal, that like, if you need 3 hours more to do what you need to do, I got to make it my business in this institution to give you the 3 hours more. So if that means we're watching basketball together, just so you trust me to teach you how to read, then that's what we're doing. And I think that's very, very important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just want to piggyback off that too. And I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, take an implicit bias test and then you'll figure, you know, I'm not limiting it to that for sure. But what Cornelius is talking about is about building relationships and seeing your students as humans. And I absolutely think it has to start there. It's also getting to know their families. And not just in a way of like, oh, I'm gonna go visit your home, which home visits have been proven to be very effective, you know, just in getting to know your students and the social and cultural context that they're living in, as well as getting to know the families. But I'm getting to know you as a human being. And if you see somebody as a human being, in the fullness of their humanity, then that's gonna counteract those biases you might have too.
So I wanted the conversation to flow without me because the news I have is quite grave. I think that teachers, as a teacher educator, I've been a teacher educator now for about 11 years. I've been a professor for 7 years. There are huge structural barriers right now to getting the kinds of teachers that we need in classrooms. I began as a classroom teacher. I taught for 6 years in Detroit public schools. I am sitting on this stage because of education reform movements, including those where our current Secretary of Education was, and I am saying that, yes, intentionally on the ILA stage, was implicated in some of that. I lost my job, as did most of the other young Black teachers in Detroit schools, raised in those schools. Of my generation. You lost an entire generation of teachers. So what seems to be happening, you have two sides of the coin. The first side is the challenge to diversifying the United States teaching force right now, so literacy, education, but across all fields, is that there are structural barriers for teacher candidates of color that have been persistent throughout time. It seems as if every generation there's a new challenge. Cornelius mentioned that when schools desegregated in the 50s through the 70s, in the mid-20th century, a lot of Black teachers lost their jobs. We see similar patterns with teachers from other communities of color. Right now, you have
particularly when charters come in, right?
Yes, charters. So the educational reform movement has also, my job loss. I was expensive to employ. I was a traditionally certified public school teacher. So I went the traditional route only to be told that we weren't getting the results and, so things needed to change. So that's your challenge. There's one more thing. Universities and colleges, no one ever listens to me. I've been saying since I was in my early 20s that if you want diverse teachers in Detroit, University of Michigan, Michigan State, the other universities around Michigan could establish a pipeline where you take, students from Detroit. There's little interest in that. Why? The economy is terrible. People need those teaching jobs for their kids. So there won't be a pipeline. So you need political action to diversify the teaching force. On thinking about the majority of teachers, you're not going to be able to press through bias to get more equitable teaching practices until people admit what they won't admit in every other sector of the economy and in every other facet of American life. We have a problem in this nation with white supremacy. It is a historic problem. It's knit into the fabric of our nation. And so therefore, I think we as teachers, teacher educators, and others, parents, community members, we have to take political action so that we can then do our work that we're called to do as educators. So you're not going to get more teachers of color without political action, and you're not going to get anti-racism and pedagogy from the majority white teaching force without political action.
So if I could add one thing to that political action, you know, I don't know how many of you know that there's a rule in federal law that every state has to have equity plans. And for the first time in, I think it was 10 years, those equity plans were called in. And having been at the US Department of Ed when they were being called in, I was almost appalled at some of the questions states would call, the State Departments of Ed would call. It's like, is this really like 2015 or 2016 when the questions were coming in? So you talk about political action. I don't know right now any one state where there is an uprising of people within that state questioning what the state has actually submitted for equity plans to the US Department of Ed. And I know this will be, well, actually I'm done with my cooling off period having been at the federal government. So I would have to say is, you know, when you look at what's happening in the Civil Rights Office at the US Department of Ed, I won't, otherwise you'd have to censor this at the moment, but and I know my colleagues would help support me on this, but as somebody who's been an administrator in every you know, local, state, national levels, one thing I will say is that we cannot shy away from being very strategic about this issue. And if anybody in a role as a leader who influences hiring practices and professional learning, et cetera, does not put into a plan to diversify across everything, experiences of educators, culture, religion, anything, ethnicity, everything, that is wrong. It is absolutely wrong because it does every kid, I don't care if you're living in white suburbia, it does every kid wrong to not be exposed to the beauty and the mosaic of what is America. And now I know that's not espoused in this current administration, but we as a group of educators who believe in social justice have to stand up and say that ought to be a goal of every single group. I have it in an organization where we can control who's on our staff. That to diversify our staff is one of our goals, and not just that, but to have everybody. It's not an either or. We're only going to have this kind of people or this kind of people. It's about how do we, with an and, all understand the beauty and the importance of social justice issues. Clearly I can go on and on, but sorry.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask one more question so I can leave time for the audience to have some questions. So now I'm going to think about literacy in a larger way. Political literacy, news literacy, since I'm a reporter. Clearly, what we saw in this election is that our nation continues to very glaringly reflect the sharp divisions that between Americans, race, class, ethnic, religious. And we now also have this problem of Americans who are not literate in news, are not literate in how government is supposed to work. And I think we're dealing with the ramifications of that.
Seriously, no.
But this is a serious thing when we think about, and part of the problem is when we talk a lot about segregation of black and brown students, but the most segregated students in the country are actually white students. They are segregated away from other children. They are in disproportionately white schools, and what that means is that they are unable to comprehend and interact in a country that does not look like that. So I wondered if a couple of you, whoever wants to, not everyone, so we have time for questions from the audience, can talk about the role that educators need to take to ensure that both themselves and their students are functionally literate in political literacy and in cultural literacy in order to be able to function in this country. That they can go on Facebook and tell the difference between a fake news article and a real news article, a real news source and a non-legit news source. Because this is actually, it's actually quite serious. When you look at polling and people think the Russia story is not a real thing, or they don't understand what is real news and what isn't, or what is the role of a democracy even, that people can't tell you how the three branches of government function, that we seem to be paying for the ramifications of that are becoming very clear.
Wow. Well.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'm not an educator.
You don't have to be.
Yeah, so we are a very polarized country, and because I publish books and acquire books for children, I think about the impact that first impressions have on kids. The first time that they see a person who comes from a different background or set of And because, the power of the brain seeking patterns, they then are noticing more the things that sort of reinforce those ideas. So when they become older, this idea that being an American, being all American, it has a certain look, impacts what they believe the rights of the people who live in this country should be. And these kids grow up, and they're the ones who are making choices. And the second that you try to take the rights away from them that they feel that they deserve, that is when we start to have these communities that are really segregated. And I personally have a really difficult time. I always have to say, I was born here. But that shouldn't matter.
That's right.
My parents were not born here, and they deserve the dignity and respect as well. And when I am looking for books to publish, it's a catchphrase that I can't remember where it came from, but I think global, act local. There is no person in the world really that is an island, that is isolated. We all impact each other throughout the world. The clothes that I'm wearing, like the price that I paid for them impacted the country where they were produced. The labor that, was gone into producing them, and then, in certain cases, the refugees that then came from those countries to the U.S. Like, all of those things have an impact, but there is a lack of agency among kids and parents in this country to recognize all of those distinctions and all of those connections. We are all connected.
What was one of the fascinating things that came out of this election, and we actually saw this during previous presidential elections with President Obama, is this notion that people who live in multiracial, multi-ethnic communities are the ones who are in the bubble, and that people who are living in 99% white communities are not in a bubble. And clearly, that's not the bubble. So I think if it's okay, I'm just going to go ahead and let us go to audience questions just so we have time. So we could applaud our panelists, and then we'll